Hello. Okay. Okay. We are live. Okay, let's begin. Guess I should do this. Or this. And then this. Where are we in the book? Of notes here, going over all the, footnotes. And be reborn on a world scale. That's the end of section 1. I was wrong earlier in saying that there weren't really sections. They just are. Okay. That from a tragic debacle, the class revolutionary party can be reborn on a world scale. In 1848, the world was reduced to Europe. And it is on the same scale that the proletarian revolution can triumph or perish. In Russia, likewise, the more advanced conditions of European and world civilization, and the existence of a proletariat not only more numerous than at the time of the English and French bourgeois revolutions, but extremely concentrated, just like the semi-feudal political power of Tsarism. Wait a minute. This doesn't sound
which
the
holds
same.
the keys to the future.
Of a proletariat not only more new. So let's just rename this. Let's do it again. And it is on the same scale that the proletarian revolution can triumph or perish. In Russia, likewise, the more advanced conditions of European civilization, and the existence of a proletariat not only more numerous than at the time of the English and French bourgeois revolutions, but extremely concentrated, just like the semi-feudal political power of Tsarism, had accelerated the revolutionary course. Starting from Asian and barbaric stagnation, it had led the proletarian political power after a brief interlude of bourgeois power. The immediate prelude had become interpenetration from the bourgeois revolution to the proletarian revolution. The triumph of the second rendering the accomplishment of the political tasks of the first anachronistic. Not only was this development insufficient to eliminate Russia's backwardness in a more advanced world civilization, but, as Lenin said in 1918 and repeated in 1920, without precisely this backwardness, the proletariat would not have taken power as easily as lifting a feather. Now here I believe I've already gotten.
The revolution is completely merged with the tempestuous momentum of the working masses of Russia and its great. A profound internationalism permeates this.
Let me just duplicate this. that at the end of... Oh wait, this is part 3. Oh, whoopsies. So I have already finished this part. I need to get to yeah, false lessons about the counter-revolution in Russia. Yeah, new. Whoops. Close on this one. There we go. Yeah, alright. Part 2. False lessons about the counter-revolution in Russia. Only Marxism can draw the lessons of history. The 20th century had so far had very imperfect... Whoa. Gotta lock in there, sister. Part 2. False lessons about the counter-revolution in Russia. Only Marxism can draw the lessons of history. The 20th century has so far had only a very imperfect awareness of this meaning and the impact of the Russian Revolution and counter-revolution that have unfolded from 1917 to the present day, and in which 50 years after October, the essence of the proletarian struggle in the imperialist era is still unhappily summarized. With the exception of the Soviets and the most obtuse anti-Soviets, there are, however, no parties, currents, or schools that have more or less clearly understood that the final historical results of the Russian Revolution were not only unrelated to the aims of the Bolshevik Party of 1917, but diametrically opposed. This disparity proved that the October Revolution, rather than progressing victoriously along its original trajectory, had been followed by a counter-revolution. Few, however, had understood this, or have an interest in stating it. But even among those who are not entirely deceived by the camouflage provided for this counter-revolution by the apparent permanence of the same ruling party in the USSR, who has been able to characterize its exact nature in both the political and economic domains? Nobody. Because outside of today's small proletarian party, none of them have failed to set the bureaucratic nationalism of Stalin's party against an alleged internationalist democratism of Lenin's party, and none of them have refused to see in the Russian economy and society some form of socialism, or at least a post-capitalism. Okay. Alright. So I did make a few mistakes in that one. So we have to listen over.
Part 2. False lessons about the counter-revolution in Russia. Only Marxism can draw the lessons of history. The 20th century has so far had only a very imperfect awareness of this meaning and the impact of the Russian Revolution and counter-revolution that have unfolded from 1917 to the present day, and in which 50 years after October, the essence of the proletarian struggle in the imperialist era is still unhappily summarized. summarized. With the exception of the Soviets and the most obtuse anti-Soviets, there are, however, no parties, currents, or schools that have more or less clearly understood that the final historical results of the Russian Revolution were not only unrelated to the aims of the Bolshevik Party of 1917, but diametrically opposed. This disparity proved that the October Revolution, rather than progressing victoriously along its original trajectory, had been followed by a counter-revolution. Few, however, had understood this, or had an interest in stating it. But even among those who are not entirely deceived by the camouflage provided for this counter-revolution by the apparent permanence of the same ruling party in the USSR, who has been able to characterize its exact nature in both the political and economic domains? Nobody. Because outside of today's small proletarian party, none of them have nobody. Domains? Nobody. Nobody. Because outside of today's
Okay, I think that's pretty good. The scientific impotence of the bourgeois world did not, of course, prevent it from drawing in its own way the lessons of the Stalinist counter-revolution, that is to say, of a historical process which it had neither understood nor even simply observed in many cases. Such is the obscurantism of the class enemy of the proletariat. For
nobody. For
For traditional bourgeois currents, the gap between the aims and the result of the October Revolution would prove the natural and therefore indestructible nature of capitalist relations of production, of the division of society into classes, of the institution of the state. In other words, the utopian character of communism, its radical impossibility. For the Social Democrats, it would prove that revolution is madness in general, and even more so the revolution in a country where capitalist development is weak. For libertarians, it would prove that any revolution that fails to destroy the state, whatever its nature on the spot, is condemned to defeat. For the workerists, who include anarcho syndicalists, social barbarists, and advocates for social
and
advocates of self-managed socialism of all kinds, it would prove that the dictatorship of the proletariat must be an unlimited political democracy for the workers, and socialism an unlimited economic democracy for producers in general. For the Trotskyists, it would prove that communism can degenerate politically when it banishes democracy, while subsisting in the economy, and thus become in need of a purely political revolution. The simple enunciation of these so-called lessons of the Russian Revolution
the Russian Revolution
Russian counter-revolution with which the bourgeois world has unceasingly overwhelmed the working class for 40 years is already enough to show that the bourgeoisie has never drawn from the historical experience any conclusions other than those which were already there in advance, based on either a quite understandable class hatred or else based on the ravages of ideology. even in the brains of the self-appointed champions of the proletariat. Indeed, if all of these lessons are never more than the repetition of age-worn tropes, they all have, despite their differences, one common characteristic. They are all directed against Marxism or revolutionary communism. That is to say, that they either proclaim bankruptcy or error, or worse still, they disfigure it under the pretext of freeing it from blame. For the advent of Stalinism and saving its honor, not hesitating, for this purpose, posthumously to transform great communists such as Lenin and Trotsky into authentic democrats. Objectively speaking, the proletarian defeat in Russia appears as a new failure of the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat, attested in the 19th century by the battles of 1848 and 1871, and at the beginning of our century by that of 1905. If this defeat is the great proletarian defeat of the 20th century, it is because the October Revolution was the first great victory. Alright, how far are we gonna go here in part 2? Maybe just to, let's see here, part 2. Maybe to the capitalist revolution is only a demi-revolution. That seems interesting. We'll finish that. If I feel like going further, which I probably won't because I really don't, I don't have the voice for this kind of thing, you know? Let me just make sure that the stream is public. I think it might be on private right now. God damn, the YouTube website is so ass. Ugh. Why can't I edit the publicity of it? There we go. Public. Save. Okay. Okay, so we're going to end once we get to this section called the capitalist revolution was only the demi-revolution. So I'm going to quick Control F, demi. Oh. Okay. Okay. Dude, you know what? I'm gonna give up on changing the YouTube stream name because the YouTube site is so shit. And if it is at the same time the greatest defeat in the history of the workers' movement, it is because in all of this history, the Russian October was the only victory won at the level of a large country. The only thing that saved communism from an accusation of doctrinal and practical bankruptcy during the previous defeats of the proletariat is that as a party it was not yet strong enough to lead the movement. But for the bourgeois enemy to attempt to overwhelm it today under this accusation about the October Okay, I need to I need to talk a little slower. Okay. Movement. But for the bourgeois enemy to attempt to overwhelm it today under this accusation about the outcomes of the Russian October, it was first necessary for communism to strengthen itself to the point of becoming the only party of the revolution and of its victory. This was not by chance, but it is what all the revisionists forget. When the bourgeoisie comes to bury communism in general under the ruins of the Russian Revolution, it logically applies the laws of war. Woe to the vanquished. But when so-called champions of the same vanquished class revise, they do not learn more the lessons of history than the bourgeoisie. They only lower their heads under the invective. The entire bourgeois world behaves as though the idea that Lenin's Communist Party pursued this and that objective, but achieved this and that diametrically opposed outcome is a logical absurdity. What? You know, sometimes I'm curious about who translated this work, because it's like, what are we doing here, guys? It's just like, the entire bourgeois world behaves as though the idea of Lenin's Communist Party pursued this and that objective, but achieved this and that diametrically opposed outcome is a logical absurdity. I guess, I mean, it makes, you have to read it in this very specific way for this to make sense. Like, I don't know how to say this out loud and make it make sense, but, you know, whatever. I'm just gonna keep going. If this were true, it would be undoubtedly... I can't do this shit. If this were true, it would Oh my god. This is why I took such a long break, huh? If this were true, it would undoubtedly be a testify... What the fuck? Okay, let me just zoom in here. If this were true, it would undoubtedly testify against us. But it so happens that throughout the history of class society, the outcomes of struggles have only in exceptional cases coincided with the objectives pursued. The contradictions between them has always been the rule, not the exception. It is historical materialism itself that had the merit of highlighting this truth, to demonstrate that, like the evolution of nature, the course of history obeys objective laws and not the conscience or the will of men, classes, and parties. In other words, historical materialism has established that men make history, but not in the conditions of their own choosing. The truth is inaccessible not only to the bourgeoisie, but also to every variant of revisionism. Indeed, none of them is able to grasp the fact that if our party's defeat in Russia proves anything, it is simply that no more than any other men, communists can't cons- communists cannot escape historical determinism. If you want to know how the proletarian party approaches the defeats of its own class, you could do no better than to study the luminous passage in which Friedrich Engels, in Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy of 1888, defines the specific method of dialectical materialism. Quote, in one point, however, the history of the development of society proves to be essentially different from that of the In one point, however, the history of the In one point, however, the history of the development of society proves to be essentially different from that of nature. In nature, insofar as we ignore man's reaction upon nature, there are only blind, unconscious agencies acting upon one another, out of whose interplay the general law comes into operation. Nothing of all that happens, whether in the innumerable apparent accidents observable upon the surface, or in the ultimate results which confirm the regularity inherent in these accidents, happens as a consciously desired aim. In the history of society, on the contrary, the actors are all endowed with consciousness, are men acting with deliberation or passion, working towards definite goals. Nothing happens without a conscious purpose, without an intended aim. Oops. But this distinction, important as it is for historical investigation, particularly of single epochs and events, cannot alter the fact that the course of history is governed by inner general laws. For here, also, on the whole, in spite of the consciously desired aims of all individuals, accident apparently reigns on the surface. That which is willed happens but rarely. In most instances, the numerous desired ends cross and conflict with one another, or these ends themselves are from the outset incapable of realization, or the means of attaining them are insufficient. Thus, the conflicts of innumerable individual wills and individual actions in the domain of history produce a situation entirely analogous to that prevailing in the realm of unconscious nature. The ends of the actions are intended, but the results that actually follow them from these actions are not intended, or when they do seem to correspond to the end intended, they ultimately have consequences quite other than those intended. Historical events thus appear on the whole to be likewise governed by chance. But where on the surface accident holds sway, there it is actually governed by inner hidden laws, and it is only a matter of discovering these laws. Unquote. Wow. Wow. Shout out Engels. I'm gonna go grab some water. All right, back. Here we go. Thus, quote, men make their own history, whatever its outcome may be, in that each person follows his own consciously desired end, and it is precisely, whoa, I can't talk. Thus, quote, men make their own history, whatever its outcome may be, in that each person follows his own consciously desired end, and it is precisely the resultant of these many the resultant of these many wills operating in different directions, and of their manifold effects upon the outer world that constitutes history. Oops, forgot to go back to this. But on the one hand, we have seen that many individual wills active in history for the most part produces results quite other than those intended, and often quite the opposite. That their motives, therefore, in relation to the total result are likely, oh my god, result are likely to the total result are likely to the total result are likewise of only secondary importance. On the other hand, the further question arises, what driving forces in turn stand behind these motives? What are the historical forces which transform themselves into these motives in the brains of the actors? The old materialism never put this question to itself, unquote. And neither do modern day revisionists. Discovering the inner hidden laws of the Russian counter-revolution, finding the driving forces, the historical cause of the motives that men, masses, parties, and leaders give themselves to, and to struggle, give themselves to act. Masses, parties, and leaders give themselves to act and to struggle. Here is the what only the guys who translated this shit, man, like, Jesus fucking Christ. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no wonder it's fucking hard to read this shit. It's like written by a toddler. No. I think it's a good text. It's just like, it's very frustrating to read this shit because it's a poor translation. Here is what only the proletarian party can explain, and what it realizes in applying this other brilliant definition from Engels in Anti-Dühring. Quote, the materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production and, next to production, the exchange of things produced is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or estates is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in man's better insight into eternal truth and justice, but in changes of the modes of production and exchange. Unquote. This cannot be grasped by all those currents which, shifting between the certain Marxist truths and the traditional outlook, undoubtedly transfer the realm of consciousness and the will of individuals and leaders to classes and parties, but consider them always as the sovereign authority in an idealistic way, without realizing that this is not to resolve the problem of determinism, but simply to displace it. This is also why they do not see that understanding history, even the history of the momentary defeat of one's own camp, is to demonstrate the inevitability of what happened and to learn from it. This is not to revise the program of scientific socialism, but to define more rigorously, in the light of the facts, the conditions for its victory. There was a little mistake here.
But
Yeah, and it.
scientific socialism, but to define more rigorously, in the light of the facts, the conditions for its victory.
Yeah, my voice is starting to act up here. How long has it been? It's been like it's been like 30 minutes. Yeah. So, conditions of its victory. Here we are. Oh, we're so close to the ending point, so I'll just keep going. It therefore remains for them to search in the abstract, drawing from the arsenal of age-old prejudices, for what other consciousness and what other will could have given past history a course more in keeping with their wishes, which themselves are more or less arbitrary, and would infallibly guarantee in the future. At this point, the dogma of the sect, and even of individual fantasy, replaces the secular cause of the proletariat according to the fashion of the day, the revolutionary militants being replaced by prophets who are more or less inspired by revealed truths, which are never anything but some form of revision, and the bourgeoisie triumphs. The bourgeois revolution. Whoops. I can't read. The bourgeois lesson, silly. The bourgeois lesson. The lesson of the counter-revolution that conforms to classical bourgeois thought would doubtless be difficult to illustrate today, given that the bourgeoisie affects to be socialist, but it is easy to construct. But it is easy to reconstruct. It has two forms, one of them vulgar, the other highbrow, which have undoubtedly always more or less coexisted, but the first of which responds better to the Stalinist phase of the counter-revolution, and the second to its Khrushchevite and post-Khrushchevite phases. The vulgar lesson consists in saying that, quote, communism is worse than capitalism, unquote. The mass of misery, obscurantism, oppression, deceit, and what Trotsky once called the somber rationality of the Stalin era assured this thesis a success that its vulgarity did not deserve. But it is certainly not in order to defend communism that Stalin's worldwide movement has for decades carried out the most extraordinary farts. Yeah, okay. I don't care if it's going to be like a choppy audiobook. I don't really care. Extraordinary falsifications in the hope that the truth would remain unknown to the workers of the West. The Proletarian Party has two responses to this version. The first and obvious one is that Stalinist Russia, and all the more so Crucifite Russia, has never had anything to do with communism, nor with any form of movement toward communism as an economic and social form. This conclusion does not belong to the Proletarian Party in particular, but the second response is more original. It indeed shows that the phase of Russian history that not only Stalinism, but also that the bourgeoisie and even Trotskyism passed off as communism without it being so in the least, was not simply the absurd and useless agony of a whole people, the series of superfluous whoa was not simply the absurd and useless agony of communism without it being so in the least passed off as communism, but also that the bourgeoisie and even Trotskyism where are we? Let's clear loop. Go this way a little bit, please. Okay. Trotskyism. Bourgeoisie and even 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 Trotskyism. Bourgeoisie. What is the deal with this fucking aux cord, man? Okay. Passed off as communist without it being so in the least. Was it not simply absurd and... Oh my god, I don't understand this translation. Was it not simply absurd and... useless agony of a whole people, the series of superfluous convulsions provoked by the arbitrariness of the despot Stalin that gormless Western propaganda has portrayed. Rather, it was a great social revolution of a nature opposed to the revolutions that the communists in Lenin's time had wanted, and yet everything other than historically sterile. It was on the contrary rich in explosive developments for the distant future, the same capitalist revolution that all advanced countries have also suffered in the past, but whose horrors and immeasurable torments they have long since forgotten. The bourgeoisie would undoubtedly not have been able to formulate the highbrow lesson about the about the Russian counter-revolution without the help of the social democratic pedants of Germany or Austria at the time of Stalin. While today it is enough to repeat that the communists of the East put themselves... What? Okay. Yeah. While today it is enough to repeat what the communists of the East themselves put forward, we can reconstruct it by saying that if Russia and the Eastern Bloc has not managed to escape from capitalist laws, the law of value, the general law of capitalist accumulation, the law of reproduction of capital, if it did not manage to find any mechanism other than exchange to link production to consumption, and if, along with the trade between the town and the countryside, it retained the sale and purchase of labor power, that is to say, the labor. That is to say, the wage labor that communism wanted to abolish, then it is because these laws and this social organization are natural and therefore as immutable as the order of the planets. For example, in other words, the Russian counter-revolution could not have been a counter-revolution, but rather the return to an order that the Bolsheviks vainly and foolishly wanted to try to modify, and at the same time this is the historical proof of the utopian and unreal character of what we call scientific socialism. Oh, okay. By claiming to draw from our class defeat a confirmation of its conservative and anti-proletarian theses, the bourgeoisie unscrupulously applies Victor's justice, but as a lesson in history. Its conclusion is doubly nil. Whoops. Its conclusion is doubly null and void. The first reason is that the Bolshevik Party and Lenin never claimed to be able to destroy at short notice the economic and social form of capitalism in Russia, as they had done to Tsarist bourgeois political domination. Has the bourgeois world really got no wind of this fact for half a century? On the contrary, they proclaimed that they were starting an international proletarian revolution whose triumph alone would make it possible, certainly not to decrease socialism in backward Russia one day, but to shorten the minimum. But to shorten to the minimum. But to shorten to the minimum the necessary phase of capitalist economic development under the political control of the proletariat. The bourgeois lesson, therefore, only proves that the democratic freedoms of the West did not in any way allow it to form a less stupid idea of the Bolshevik Revolution than that which was imposed as a state dogma for dozens of years in Russia by the much maligned Stalinist dictatorship. This lesson is therefore void, and above all for the overriding reason that scientific socialism constitutes a whole conception of history and of the world, for which the ideologues of the bourgeoisie, no more than before October 17, were incapable of providing a theoretical refutation, and from which, on the contrary, they are forced by reality to plunder some truths. One could not, therefore, do better than to oppose true communism to the lightweight bourgeois accusation of utopia. The point here is obviously not to conceive the class enemy, but to fight defeatism in the proletariat, and above all clearly to establish the theoretical basis for the refutation of the revisionist lessons that we will do later, since without ever presenting the same obscurantist audacity as in the bourgeois lessons, they reflect the same rejection of scientific socialism or the same powerlessness to understand it. Whew. Okay, I think I'm done. It's been like an hour now. Yep. All right. I'm gonna call it quits. It was a good productive session.